-1. Yeah.
Okay, should we start? Yes. So a warm welcome to everyone to this week of debate and our launch event, which, to our knowledge, is the first high-level all-female discussion on the future of the fiscal rules and fiscal policy in Europe. The panel is in the professional hands of Paola Tama from Politico Europe, and I'll hand the floor to Paola in a short moment. I'll just give you a bit of background, why we think fiscal matters and why we organize this week of debate. I should first tell you that this week of debate is taking place under the official patronage of the European Parliament and the European Social Economic Committee. We're grateful as it shows, in our view, a support for a democratic debate. I'll start with who we are. We are trade unions, economic and financial think tanks, environmental groups, youth organizations, both at national and European level. And we all convinced that fiscal policy has a major impact on the lives of EU citizens. It has been a taboo of sorts for 2 decades, as the focus has been on reducing government spending, leave the direction of the economy to markets. Of course, fiscal policy has made a big comeback in reaction to the pandemic with substantial fiscal expansion in the form of short-term support to the economy, and then recovery plans, which will be rolled out in the coming years. We believe that the comeback of fiscal policy as a central piece of the financial system is a good thing, but also that it should stay. Of the 3 financial powers with central banks and financial markets, it's the only one that is truly democratic and able to take Europe away from the current crisis. So economic crisis, environmental crisis, but also social crisis, and take us towards a sustainable, resilient future. Central banks, financial markets are in fact blind without the direction and the leadership of fiscal policy. And in fact, both actors are begging for fiscal policy to be bolder and to stay in the long term. This also makes sense, finally, from a macroeconomic perspective, as constraining the necessary investments today to save money would actually be a very bad calculation, as most economists agree, as the risks that would materialize in the future would cost us many times more than the investments needed today, as we see precisely with the pandemic. Now, to finish, fiscal policy is usually reserved for discussions behind closed doors among ministries of finance, and we think this needs to change, hence this week of debate. And we hope all points of view are able to express themselves and then contribute to the intense policy making that will be taking place in the next few weeks and months. To finish, please use the hashtag fiscal matters to communicate on social media Also check our website, fiscalmatters.eu. And note that the event will be recorded. And finally, wish you a great week of debate. And do stay tuned because there will be more after this week. Paola?
Thank you for the introduction, Benoit, and welcome everyone. Thanks to all panelists for being with us. My name is Paola Tama. I am a reporter with Politico Europe, and I'll be your moderator for today's launch event. To set the scene a little, the European Union, as Benoit just said, is in a better, I would argue, position than a year ago, having managed the coronavirus response from a health perspective with the vaccine procurement and an economic perspective by agreeing on this unprecedented recovery fund over a year ago, as well as triggering the general escape clause until 2023, which allowed member states to issue substantial support and substantial debt to prop up their economies. The question, therefore, is where are we going from now on? And for non-acolytes, EU rules, as they are, require that countries reduce their deficit to 3% of GDP and to 60% of GDP in any given year. And these numbers are enshrined in EU treaties, and there's currently no proposal for reform of treaty change. So this threshold will remain the same. But the EU's economic governance is up for review, and there's plenty of room for discussion on what should come next, what should be counted as debt, what pace should EU countries return to this threshold at, what should the Commission do if they don't, and so on and so forth. In the coming year, the confrontation will intensify between those countries, especially high indebted countries who want to relax the rules, and fiscally conservative countries who wish a swift return to fiscal discipline. And a compromise will need to be found since all 27 EU countries need to sign up to any reform of the rules. There is also a time factor because the new rules need to be in place by 2023, which is when the general escape clause runs out. And the goal is to find a consensus, quote, well in time for 2023, as Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said in her State of the Union speech. So that gives EU countries relatively little time, especially considering that the two main power brokers, France and Germany, are very self-centered on their election and post-election coalition talks in Germany, from where I'm speaking to you today. And this is, in broad strokes, the backdrop against which we're debating EU fiscal rules. In the distinguished company of our guest panelists, so let me welcome in turn Elena Flores-Gual, who is Deputy Director General at the European Commission's Economic and Financial Policy Department. Welcome, Elena. And then we will have Vivien Schmidt, who is Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration at Boston University, and Pavlina Cherneva, who is Director of the Economic Democracy Initiative at the Open Society University Network, Associate Professor of Economics at Bard College, and Research Scholar at the Levy Economics Institute in New York. Welcome, everyone. We'll also be shortly joined by Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, who is co-president of the Club of Rome. To kick it off, I'd like to give the time for each panelist to give a little 3 minutes opening statement in response to the question of, are EU fiscal rules fit for purpose? Should they change, and if so, how? Can I please give the floor to Elena to go first?
Thank you very much. I hope I can fit with the 3 minutes, but otherwise we will take up in the conversation. I fully share this first position, saying fiscal policy is about spending and taxation, and this is fundamental political choices. So that's something it's an approach that I think is very important to keep in mind. Second, we have to have this debate against the current economic situation in the current context, taking into account the experience we had during the pandemic in particular. And indeed, what fiscal policy did now has nothing to do with what fiscal policy did back in 2008 and 9, so the previous crisis. And that tells us a number of things. So we need to look at the lenses, with the lenses about where we are, and also this big uncertainty we have still now of the links between epidemiological situation and economic developments. And I think we will be still faced with this uncertainty. So that's the context in which we need to think. Now, we also say and know that policy support needs to remain in place, but it has to change. It has to be different in content. And that's what we need to think about, how the framework will help us to do this shift in what fiscal policy needs to do from overall general support to more targeted and facilitating the transition, the green and digital transition, and to address inequalities. And behind that is the huge need for investment. So we have that, and we have the huge amount of debt that has happened also during this year. So how do we set a framework that helps us to deal with these two challenges that can be compatible or cannot? So, and that I think we need to recognize that not everything is compatible. And that's the big difficulty. So what we have already said before the crisis, that the framework need to be revised, because the experience told us that the framework we have is overly complex, hampering transparency, ownership of the rules, and enforceability. So that we said in the review we published back in 2020. We said that public debt was at very high levels and differentiated across countries, which might create problems for EMU. That has increased now, but it was already the case back in 2020. And we also saw at that point that the composition of public finances evolved in the wrong direction, let's say. So the share of public investment, to simplify, was declining. So that's what we said. Now, what we have learned is that in the crisis, the economy has experienced output losses and government deficits have increased strongly, as well as debt. But we also see that heterogeneity is higher now. Second, we see the new investment needs for the transitions, as I mentioned, and we see that we need to think about the combination of public and private investment and how public money can be best used also to trigger private investment. So we need to make this link from the beginning. And third, that, okay, we have activated this general active clause, as you said, until 22 so far, and we need to see how we deal with that. And the main challenges here that we have is, well, I would say the key issues is facilitate investment, have a realistic debt reduction and a credible framework and rule, how we go about centralizing versus decentralizing, and what we do with this 360% that for sure we are not going to change the treaty. So that's part of the challenge. And I think there are some other elements that we need to keep in mind as well, which is the focus on over the medium term, the increasing importance of the policy mix. So we need to look together fiscal and monetary. The central fiscal capacity that may be there or may not, but we are experiencing now something with the RRF that will tell us also how this works together with the national fiscal policies. And then it goes a little bit broader because we also have other variables that are not purely fiscal, which is like the macro imbalances procedure that is part of the framework. And we also need to think about how we integrate that. So that sets a bit the scene. I'm not kind of coming with proposals, but with as a matter of introduction, that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That gave us a really good overview. Can I now turn to Pavlina for her introductory remarks?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. Yes, absolutely, I agree that the framework needs to be revised. The focus now needs to be on fiscal policy and how it can do the heavy lifting that's needed to address some very urgent concerns that we have present. I think I want to frame my comments in the following sense, that just focusing on the fiscal rules alone will not be adequate. And we need to be thinking very carefully about funding mechanisms. So while I appreciate very much the challenges with revising the treaty, I think it's still important for us to shine a spotlight there and to realize what it means to have lost the fiscal space when countries joined the Eurozone. I think that's reasonably well recognized, that they have given up sovereignty, but that was not replaced by alternative mechanisms for funding and policy, policy at the Euro-wide level to add the fiscal space that was taken away when sovereignty was surrendered. Now, in a way, you can think of this as us, the Euro design engineering financial scarcity. And what COVID has shown us, but I think 2008 also showed us the same lesson, that when we need to react at a large scale, we actually have tools in sovereign currency nations to address the scale of the problem. So in countries that issue their own currencies, that control their own currencies, there is, I would say, very much an ongoing coordination that happens between the monetary and fiscal authority, even though coordination has become very much of a hot topic today. And I think, because the scale of the intervention has been so large that it has concentrated the mind, and people have now started realizing that the pay for question is really not the correct question, that we do have the tools. And Europe, relaxed the rules, came up with alternative financing arrangements to be able to tackle the crisis. So in a sense, it kind of restored partially its sovereignty to be able to finance governments and to be able to execute their domestic policy. But in other countries, this kind of coordination happens on any given day. And that means very simply that the central bank maintains the payment system. The governments, when they spend, all bills are paid, checks don't bounce, and they're safe and default risk-free assets. And these are the questions that we are now asking with respect to Europe. How do we provide that kind of institutional architecture to permit fiscal policy? So while I do agree that we need to relax the rules, and perhaps we need to double or triple the deficit debt criteria, for me, those are not appropriate policy targets. When we think about resilience, we need to be thinking about the direction and the content of government spending rather than arbitrary accounting ratios. And most importantly, that we still are operating under a framework of pooling of funds, of contributions, intra-Eurozone pooling of funds. And so it's that funding mechanism that I think will be a problem when we talk about solidarity, resilience. It is a bit akin to what one hand gives, the other one takes away. And so there will still be the sentiment that some governments are more profligate than others, as long as people perceive that it is their funding that is providing the Euro-wide support. So I'm just going to conclude by saying that we do need to ask about questions about architecture, about funding mechanism, and finding a way of either providing a net spender for the Eurozone as a whole, or allow countries to retain their autonomy and finance their national priorities by securing their government debt. And I will just end it here. There are a lot more questions we can discuss in the Q&A.
Broadening the field. Thanks again. Let's turn now to Vivian for her introductory remarks.
Yeah, so delighted to be on this panel. Thanks for inviting me. And my remarks follow on the other two wonderful introductory remarks. And I'm going to shift the discussion a bit to focus in on the fiscal rules and governance. And when we talk about the EU fiscal framework needing to be fit for purpose, for this, the EU needs to do three things. One, it should build on the COVID-19 responses to promote the green transition, digital transformation, and to address inequalities, as Elena has already said. It should reform the fiscal rules to be at most loose guidelines, with the state at the EU and national level playing a much more entrepreneurial role, focused on new industrial strategies. And it has to decentralize and democratize the governance processes in order to ensure not only better economic outcomes, but also increasing political legitimacy. So just very briefly then on these 3 points, first to build on the COVID-19 responses, as Benoit Lallemand said, basically we need to rethink the economic philosophy behind the Stability and Growth Pact, which has been focused on stability to the detriment of growth. When here we need to emphasize growth rather than stability, turn the temporary fund, the RRF, into a permanent one, and recognize that debt is not the problem, lack of investment is and has been. and that investment is really the only way out of the high deficits and debts accumulated during the COVID-19 crisis. You can't cut your way out of debt, and that really is the lesson of the Eurozone crisis. So then, how do we reform the fiscal rules? It seems to me that we need to end what I called in a recent book, governing by rules and ruling by numbers in the Eurozone, which involved the wrong rules and ill-conceived numbers. These caused problems across the Eurozone as countries without the fiscal space could not invest, and those with the fiscal space did not invest. It also, of course, caused political problems, a crisis of legitimacy that actually ended only with the new solidarity that has been shown in response to the COVID-19 crisis with the RRF and the New Generation EU. The EU cannot and should not go back to the formal stability rules as reinforced in the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis, and which in any case have been reinterpreted more flexibly over time and suspended with the escape clause. So what to do with the current fiscal rules? My preference would actually be to get rid of the numerical targets altogether, but I know that this is very difficult given that they're legally embedded throughout the treaties and politically contentious, as previous speakers mentioned. So my sense is we should think of these as guidelines or as ideals rather than fixed numerical targets, and at least don't count in the deficits any investments that address the contemporary challenges, greening the economy, digitalizing society, and reducing inequalities. But for other national investments, one should follow the golden rule, meaning don't count as deficits and debt any investments in growth enhancing areas writ large, such as those focused on education, training, research and development, infrastructure, digital as well as physical, social inequalities. And this may be a bit contentious, eliminate the debt break from national constitutional legislation. Actually, much of this already seems to be going on currently with the Eurozone fiscal governance following COVID. But there's another piece for this, which would be to increase decentralization and democratization. If we think about European semester involvement at the national level, there's already important amounts of decentralization that have been put into it since COVID-19. The Commission, instead of seemingly top-down oversight focused on the fiscal rules, has become a bottom-up facilitator of national industrial strategies. Now, conditionality via structural reform appears mainly focused on promoting better national economic governance, i.e. better administration, fighting corruption, as opposed to the early years of the Eurozone crisis, which it looked like much more about crushing unions, cutting welfare. But the point here is this is bottom up only for national capitals. And arguably, this is still too centralized a process, need national decentralization to the regions and the cities, and democratization. Bring in the social partners, civil society to discuss investment needs, and bring in national parliaments. With a more decentralized and democratic process, one could have better investment, and more transparency and citizen involvement would help avoid corruption and clientelism. Plus, this would combat a way to combat populism. At the EU level, the question would be, how do you democratize the process? What one would have to do is not only continue with the Commission review process as it is, but more democratized and decentralized. But in the interactions with the Council itself would need to be more transparent and accountable through more deliberation, open deliberation and debate, and the European Parliament should be involved, especially since this is about fiscal redistribution. Finally, what can substitute for the rules and numbers so as to ensure some guidance, some sense of overall direction for the Eurozone economy? Why not something that we could call the Great Macroeconomic Dialogue that would happen every year or two with all institutional actors, social partners, representative civil society meeting to discuss, to set directions, to give guidance to EU institutional actors in place of numerical targets. And I should stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. We're almost on time. I would like to give the floor to the organizers to play a short video intervention by Mariana Mazzucato, who couldn't be with us due to personal reasons, but she did want to participate at least through a brief contribution. So we'll play that next, and then we'll turn to the debate proper, given you've given us plenty of food for thought here.
Thanks. I will share my screen.
I'm Mariana Mazzucato. I'm a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London. Thank you for inviting me to the very important launch of Fiscal Matters Week. I'm very sorry I'm not there with you. Unfortunately, I am moving today, as you can see from the boxes behind me, after 21 years of living in one home, moving to another. So it's a very busy day, and unfortunately the timing hasn't worked. So yes, of course we must change fiscal rules, but we need to get our hands dirty with the details. First of all, we must remember that after the financial crisis, there was very stringent rules attached to what at the time were the recovery funds from the financial crisis. Each member state had to promise to, reduce their deficit. There was an obsession with the number 3%. Slowly that became 0%. Some countries were even proud to have a surplus. But the irony is that those cuts in public sector spending and investment actually increased debt to GDP. This is one of the kind of, obvious things, but that we sometimes forget. Deficits and debt to GDP are not the same thing. And if you're actually cutting all the long run drivers of productivity growth and long run GDP, like public sector education, public funding of research and development, but also public funding of health systems, which make us all healthier and have, well-being at the center of how we live. This is not good for growth. And of course, we shouldn't just invest in those areas for growth, but the spillover is good actually for those long run drivers of growth. So countries like Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Goldman Sachs called them the pigs, terrible word. They almost all actually ended up having an increase in debt to GDP when they were trying to reduce their deficit. So it's not only wrong for all sorts of reasons that have to do with our well-being, but it's even wrong just from economic sense. This time around, what's interesting with COVID-19 is that there are actually conditions with the EU Next Gen in terms of investing in areas that have to do with climate change and with digitalization. Now, that's important because that means the kind of growth we want is not just growth for growth's sake, but growth that is directed, that tilts the playing field, doesn't level it, towards sustainable growth, inclusive growth. Inclusive why? Well, if we reduce the digital divide, we will have less inequality. Sustainable growth, because if we're making those kinds of needed green investments across all our different sectors, that will be, fostering a particular type of growth. What my work has been highlighting is that requires a certain type of capacity within our governments, within our public administrations, which unfortunately we don't have. Why do we not have that? Because the rhetoric, the propaganda, the ideology that at best government is there to fix market failures, at worst, get out of the way, Thatcher, Reagan, but at best, by the illuminated, it's to fix market failures. That doesn't actually justify the kinds of investments we need within the public sector to co-create and co-shape markets and to direct them, for example, around sustainable growth paths. That requires very dynamic structures for our procurement funds with conditionality at the center. It requires grants and loans of whether it's public banks or different types of investments, including guaranteed loans that we might have, for example, from a Department of Energy, to be really structured so to create additionality, to actually galvanize, catalyze investments that wouldn't have happened anyway. That would make the multiplier also higher. Like the classic Keynesian multiplier is higher, the more ambitious, strategic, and mission-oriented our public investments are. And lastly, what do I mean by mission-oriented? I mean that what these public funds should be doing, besides existing, and so yes, we need to reduce the kind of fiscal stringent measures which didn't work in the past and won't work in the future. what the mission-oriented approach for public investment suggests is that we should be focusing on problems, carbon neutral cities, fighting, a knife crime in a city like London, where we have had an increase in youth crime, strengthening our health systems and making sure that everyone gets vaccinated, reducing the digital divide to zero. All these things mean instead of just having handouts, subsidies, and guarantees, we need to restructure our programs, again, whether it's procurement, public bank loans, grants, and so on, to be outcomes-oriented, problem-oriented, mission-oriented, and get the job done. So not only should we reduce our fiscal rules, we also need to invest within our public administrations in order to implement an ambitious strategic public program that fosters a particular type of growth, more inclusive and more sustainable. Thank you so much, and apologies again for not being there with you today.
Thanks for playing that. And now we're going to turn to the debate proper. Just a couple of housekeeping things for those watching. Thanks for being with us. You can interact by putting your questions in the Q&A function down below in the screen. And you can also vote for each other's questions so that they will rise to my attention, and then I will try to put them to my panelists. Please also state your name, and if you have a specific addressee, who should I ask the question to? We'll have a specific Q&A question at the session at the end, but if there is a question that just strikes me as pertinent, I will put it directly to the speakers. And I'm going to launch also the first poll. We're going to have two during the course of the debate, and the one will be, are the fiscal rules fit for purpose? You can vote again in the poll function just below. We'll get back to the results later, also giving a panelist a chance to react. I think so far the answer from the panel seems no. So let's start again with our panelists. And Elena, I would like to ask you, I think that the general sense that I get from the debate on the review of the economic governance is that there is a need for change, but there is also a need to return to sustainable debt levels, as you mentioned. And I think the question is, how do we do that? Vivian said you can't cut your way out of debt. It's a point also Pavlina made. There are, however, voices which argue that we should reduce debt rather swiftly and go back to the thresholds that we mentioned, these numbers, as quickly as possible. Others argue for greater leeway for investment to generate sustained and sustainable growth, so growing out of debt rather than cutting it. What do you think should be the balance? What is the best way to return to fiscal sustainability in the middle to long term?
Thanks. Yeah, okay, I will try to address your question, and maybe if we have time, then I could come to some of the things that have been said by other colleagues here in the panel. I think that indeed debt sustainability is related to the let's say the imbalance on the budget side, but it is also related to growth, as it has been clearly said. So if one does policies that reinforces the growth potential, then you can have more space to do fiscal policy. So clearly the two are totally interlinked, and I would say that the way to use the public resources, wherever you put the rule. So I don't really focus on these numbers. Wherever you put the rule, and when I say rule, I'm not thinking about 3 and 60%. I'm thinking about any possible rule, a debt rule or an expenditure rule or any other possibilities than one could imagine that have been debated. Wherever you put the rule, you have to have something that gives incentives to the decision makers to decide how to spend this money in a way that is going to reinforce growth. Because after all, that's what you want. So that's the way I think, at least at the technical level, we are approaching this reflection now to see if we think that we need some sort of rule, because in a monetary union, we need some guidance that we avoid that there is too much heterogeneity in terms of fiscal positions. But this rule has to provide the right incentives to the decisions on how to use fiscal policy in order to reinforce growth. And again, there I think we also need to not to forget, because usually we focus on spending, but there is also the tax side of it. And we don't have rules on the tax side at the EU level for many reasons, but because this is an area that member states are very keen to keep on their hands for reasons. But it is the combination of the two that makes the difference, the taxation and the spending. So that's what I would say. And what I think it is important to see is that on what we are doing now with this next generation EU financing, and in particular with the RRF, is I would say a good experiment. Unfortunately, we will not have time to learn all the lessons before we come up with a new governance. But the interesting experiment is that there is an agreement with the member states, and this is a bottom-up exercise where member states say, okay, we are going to use the public money available both at national and EU level in order to do this, meaning investments, but also this, meaning reforms. And this combination, the reforms and investments agreed with the member states and generated in a bottom-up manner, I think is a good way to provide incentives to use the available public resources in the right way. So that's an example of I think, how to reinforce the growth part of this. And I think that when we think about the governance, to me, more than the proper fiscal rules in a narrow sense, it's more to think about the whole system, how we provide the right incentives. And we think a lot about public money that we can have available at the EU level that can also trigger the private. And this is the RRF goes like in that direction, but also the Invest EU program goes in that direction. So to add some public money that can trigger private investment in order to reinforce the growth part of the economy and therefore facilitate the sustainability.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk a bit about the fallback option, maybe with Pavlina. So the return of the fiscal rules as we know it would entail substantial budget restructuring in a significant number of EU countries, potentially, critics say, frustrating recovery efforts. We've heard that from Benoit just earlier. So Pavlina, what would be the return of business as usual mean for the EU, and what do you think should substitute it instead?
Okay, I think that going back to the rules is going to be economically detrimental. I think that they will be for all the reasons that Mariana highlighted. You can't cut your way out of, out of the debt, perceived debt problem or engineered debt problem, as I stated at the beginning. I think yields will diverge. Countries will have to make necessary sacrifices, and that will have real costs. We've already seen this. It's just doesn't make sense to repeat the old mistakes. But I do want to talk a little bit more about how arbitrary the rules are. There is a certain incoherence in these rules. I mean, let's just take the deficit to GDP ratio. The first thing that I think all realize is that that's a moving target. So, one might say, okay, this could be just a benchmark, but we know that government budgets are anti-cyclical. We know that you can't control either side, either the tax revenue or the spending. We don't have direct control because there are a lot of endogenous forces at hand that drive them. So that's number one. But from a macro perspective, every deficit is somebody else's surplus. So if we have restrained government deficits at 3%, we have effectively constrained non-government surpluses at 3%. And I don't see any economic logic or reason to say that we should be constraining the surpluses that are accumulating in the rest of the economy from government deficit spending. Now, the reason is because we've engineered artificial financial constraints. So, governments are at the behest of private markets to finance themselves. But in sovereign currency nations, they have independent finance. They finance themselves in their own resources through their own central banks and ministries of finance. So if a government is spending 3% of GDP, they're making a net contribution to the economy in terms of net financial assets, that is a surplus accumulating somewhere in the economy. Now, you could talk about distributional issues, but there's no logic to say that 3% is the optimal level. Let's make it 6%. In the depths of a crisis, we have spent 20% of GDP. We have had to spend regularly more than 10%. And if the climate challenges are so large and require a lot of fiscal resources, doesn't seem like that would be even kind of a useful long-term target. So there are many other reasons that the rationale for deficits being set at a particular goalpost just doesn't make sense, but it's the same thing for debt, because a government debt is a non-government asset. So once again, we are saying that we want to reduce the assets that are being held by the private sector. I think the question that we want to ask is, if I'm holding government debt, is that a safe asset? Is that an asset that is default risk-free, which is the case for countries that accumulate that have sovereign currency regimes? And when you look at the cases like Japan or the United States, debt to GDP ratios highest in history, near 300%. It's not an economic objective to reduce that number. That just represents the assets that the private sector is holding, and that those are safe assets. So I think that it's really important to have an appreciation of how dysfunctional these accounting ratios, goalposts are, and that we need to be thinking of different kind of fiscal rules. And I fully appreciate the challenges at the legal and the political level, but at least we should be asking the right questions. And from there, then I would say our fiscal rules need to be based on maybe some robust automatic stabilizers that provide economic support to the euro area as a whole. I think we have had some experience with the expanded unemployment insurance program. I would say we should go further. We should maybe have employment stabilizers. We can think creatively of various ways in which we can stabilize the eurozone through its fluctuations. But then, of course, we have looming challenges. I completely agree with Elena that the public health concerns are going to be perennial, and the climate concerns are unavoidable. These are costs that are baked into our budget. So we need to be thinking in terms of funding those priorities in a way that does not bankrupt nations.
Thanks. I'm going to maybe turn to Vivian on one question, which just goes perfectly on what you just said about how to account expenditures. It's the point that you made. You said that almost no expenditure which has a public benefit should be accounted toward the deficit threshold. This is something which has been circulating as an idea in certain treasuries as to at least picking investments which are related to the green transition, the European Commission's Green Deal objectives of decarbonizing by mid-century. And climate change is arguably a type of shock whose consequences will be felt throughout the Union. So again, like COVID, giving a horizontal shock, hitting everyone differently, but not leaving anyone outside of it. So what is the argument in favor of discounting these investments from counting toward deficit thresholds? But then on the other hand, I would also ask you, how do you answer the criticism that once we start including certain investments, investment in green, or as you've said more broadly, investment in everything which is growth generating, countries will be able to pick and choose what you count toward that levels, and therefore making EU governance uneven and ultimately irrelevant if we are to arrive to a more homogeneous level of fiscal standing.
Okay, well, when one thinks about investment, if it's investment for growth, if it's in growth enhancing areas, it's going to produce growth, and therefore it's not going to contribute to deficits. On the contrary, it's likely to reduce deficits, or at least ultimately reduce debt. We're in a position where, as I mentioned earlier, that and we saw it in the COVID-19 pandemic. Those countries that had no fiscal space actually did not invest in those areas that were necessary, such as health, also education, training, etc. And you see in those countries higher levels of unemployment and tremendous difficulty responding to the COVID-19 crisis initially. So I think that there are no arguments against it. And essentially, so long as, I mean, there's still the European semester, there's still the Commission that can make recommendations if it sees that the investment is not going in the right area. So there are safeguards. But I'd actually like to get back to sort of the questions of governing by rules and numbers, and also this great macroeconomic dialogue. I mean, if we think about the rules, why is a democratic dialogue better than governing by rules and ruling by numbers? The rules themselves were a political invention at a particular place and time, when Germany worried not just about Italy, but also about France, as they're entering, as the Maastricht Treaty happens, and then in the run-up to EMU. And they wanted strict rules for everybody to obey to ensure that the currency would look and act like the Deutschmark. And so if this may have worked for Germany and Northern Europe, which had corporatist bargaining systems, but not countries with different varieties of capitalism and growth models, where the state also normally had played an important role in providing guidance for investment for growth. And what we've seen is actually a big differentiation, really, increasing divergence amongst EU economies rather than convergence, largely due to the structure of the EU and the way in which the rules themselves were structured. And if we look at the numbers are actually themselves largely picked out of thin air. There are anecdotal accounts that the 3% deficit was Mitterrand's number, Mitterrand, the great economist, that they picked it because the French president had used that number once. And the 6% debt was assumed to be the ideal level and subsequently was disproven, and suggestions that it's more like 90%. And if we think about macroeconomic governance before EMU, at the national level, it took many different forms, from basically government direction to Germany's Bundesbank control. All of these efforts were to ensure economic stability and growth. Some countries followed a hard money route, say Germany, others a soft money route, France, Sweden, the UK, Italy, and all prospered in the post-war period. Even in the case of the Bundesbank, which was obsessed mainly with inflation and used the narrative of the dangers of hyperinflation of 1923 to focus on low inflation, actually, the problem was really deflation in 1931 that led to the rise of Hitler. But even in the case of the Bundesbank, it involved much more flexible macroeconomic governance with targets that then social partners would bargain around. Only with the advent of neoliberalism and monetarism, et cetera, did things change as country by country shifted to macroeconomic orthodoxy. But they still had leeway until EMU. And even then, these rules were loose enough to be accommodating for most member states until the Eurozone crisis and the reinforcement of the rules with sanctions, et cetera, and rapid fiscal consolidation, in particular for countries that were in trouble. We now see that this particular regime didn't work, and that in fact, the Commission and the Council agreed to the reinterpreting the rules to ensure that all countries flourished. So why not admit this? But once you do this, we still have the question of rules, as Elena mentioned. And for that, the reason I suggested this great macroeconomic dialogue, think of an annual or biannual discussion of general EU targets for inflation, growth, and to say, okay, where should we invest next? Health, greening the economy, whatever else. This could also provide guidance to the ECB and legitimacy for their actions without breaching their independence, because it ensures that they then begin to act in the shadow of EU politics. It legitimizes then a shift into green bonds and other sorts of things for which they still hesitate. So any number of reasons why this should be the case, why one should really shift to thinking much more about how do we ensure investment and stop worrying about, oh my goodness, they're going to breach this arbitrary number rather than thinking, how can we all move together? And for that, and I agree with the other speakers, there needs to be more investment at the EU level, many, many more carrots, as opposed to the sticks approach that we had before.
Thanks for that answer. I want to introduce Sandrine to the rest of the panel. Thanks for joining us and for being with us today. Sandrine, I would like you maybe to give us the perspective on, we have had a very broad debate so far, and we'll try to narrow it down to the concrete policy changes that we could envision. But for now, would you like to give us your perspective on what goals should the economic governance of the EU in the future have?
Thank you, Paula, and it's really a pleasure to join this esteemed panel. And I'm actually going to reflect on a little bit of the questions that are also in the chat that I'm starting to see that are coming up. And the first is one that I also have, which is coming from Elena's point, and this was made by Mariana and Pavlina, the fact that we're still addressing growth as the main systems direction that we want to go into, I find quite troubling. And I do think that it demonstrates that we're anchoring ourselves in very old paradigms when we could actually take COVID as a way to start to think through the transformation. Now, I'm not saying that's not complex and difficult, because we are caught up in the old rules that we already have in place with regard to fiscal policy. But I think it does reflect also on Finance Watch's very important article that came out in Your Active, that we need to think about future generations, and that we need to think about how we start to quantify and qualify our engagement, we as people, with the economy and with the financial system. And I do not believe, and many of the members of the Club of Rome and those that we speak with, including, by the way, the European Commission, when it starts to look through foresight and the way in which it wants to engage in new economic models, such as the well-being model or donut economic model, which, by the way, was coming here into the chat, is how do we take into consideration the limits to the planetary boundaries and the way we as people engage within those limits. And that means that we need to think about two things. One is the emergency at hand. So what are those short-term levers that enable us to start to really shift the fiscal policy and also the economic system away from just a growth paradigm, because that is not what's going to enable us to actually build resilience within the system. And the other is, how do we then look at what those true long-term system shifts are? Because we have to start talking about a financial system that is in service to a regenerative and post-pandemic economy, which means that we have to look at financial public flows and the subsidies, a total shift of the way in which our markets are fundamentally based, so that they do actually influence, and in particular public dollars, start to really service public good, commonwealth, and the real essentials of the economy. And I want to tap into some of what was said, which is, if we look at surveys actually out there, most of the public is indicating very clearly that they do and are ready to look at a very different economic paradigm. We've just actually done a G20 survey. 75% of those who were interviewed have indicated that, one, we need to cost the global commons, and two, we need to come back to what is most important to people's lives and livelihoods. Are we really taking that into consideration when we're looking at our fiscal policy? And are we looking at the role in which public sector finance really plays in that? So the first is, we have to move beyond GDP, and we have to reimagine and reprioritize our fiscal needs. And the second is that we need to realign fiscal spending and investment priorities first on truly ensuring that we eliminate extractive and degenerative public investments and tax policies, such as fossil fuel subsidies, capital investment subsidies over labor, and the really out of proportion defense of expenditures. And this comes back to some of what was already said by Vivian in particular, and also Pavlina, and start to come back to really basing also an emphasis on social important factors as well as educational factors, which we do not invest enough in. And maybe the last point is taking into consideration my experience on the taxonomy and also the sustainable finance platform, and looking at the complexity of putting in place rules and regulations that truly do have social and environmental criteria, I think it is fundamental that actually the European Commission does continue to play that role, to put forward a strong framework that hopefully will not consistently be politicized, but instead truly focus on how we can implement the Green Deal, how we can truly move towards a well-being economy that the donut economic system would actually grant us. And this is the key complexity. This is the reality. And it shows also that within the recovery, even if we ask to mainstream climate and environmental objectives, in most of the recovery plans, most of the money is being spent on infrastructure that was already going to be built. It is not new green infrastructure spending as we would have liked. And in many cases, nature is not even taken into consideration. So some of the other environmental goals are not being taken into consideration either.
Thanks for that. I'm slightly conscious of time, so I'm going to ask to all of my panelists to keep their answers slightly shorter in the second round, just so that we can interact slightly more. I'm going to call in the results of the first poll. So to the question, are the fiscal rules fit for purpose? Out of 97 participants, 88 said no and 9 said yes. So I'm not entirely surprised by that result. And I'm going to launch the second one, which is, are you confident that EU fiscal rules will be changed before the end of 2022? We'll get to the results slightly later. Now, in this first half of our panel, we kind of focused on what's wrong with European fiscal and economic governance in general as it is. How can it be changed? I'd like to focus more on the concrete answers that we could give to these questions, maybe to give some food for thought to the Commission. And Sabrina, I would like to turn to you again, because in your answers, in your work, and just before you mentioned that we need, in any community of states which pool sovereignty in terms of a monetary union, there needs to be some returns on their sovereignty in the form of some fiscal space, some sort of buffer, which could serve everyone in hard times. What do you think could happen in the EU? So in terms of one idea which was put forward by Vivian was to have some sort of macroeconomic dialogue, which could serve as some sort of guidance for the ECB. What, according to you, is the role in the ECB if fiscal and monetary policy are to work hand in hand beyond the crisis moment that we have lived through the past year and a half?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paula. I think to start off, I want to agree with Sandrine's point that fiscal space is not a financial concept. It's a real concept, right? We want to be thinking about environmental boundaries, about the resources we have to tackle the specific challenges before us. We have become accustomed in Europe to very high levels of unemployment. Now, that is an enormous waste of resources that are there to deal with public health crisis, environmental crisis, all hands on deck kinds of challenges. And so we've got a lot of space in terms of our real resources. Now, so the thinking needs to be in terms of how we deploy them, where do we direct the investments? In terms of the role of the ECB, I think that they will be faced with the question once again, whether they will provide support for individual government financing the way that they have done it in the pandemic. And in a way, we have kind of rediscovered the features of the monetary system, that the monetary system has to provide flexible finance. Now, are we going to go back to a scenario where we will say, well, for some countries, we will not provide flexible finance, and then they will deal with the divergent sort of rates and yields and challenges in raising funds for the policy priorities? I think that will be a Euro-wide question, especially if solidarity is going to be kind of at the forefront of how we go forward. So I think the ECB can do a number of things, is, keep credit conditions relaxed and, not preemptively raise rates. I think that some sort of a guarantee, implicit guarantee will be useful. Should governments still rely on markets to raise funding, they will need to provide some sort of sense of security for those instruments. Again, I want to focus on the necessary coordination, even if we do some sort of fiscal policy at the Euro level as a whole that will be targeted towards green investments. Our budget is rather small, right? We have, what, 1% of GDP at the Euro level. It's not enough to, take the big, bold investment that is necessary. So crafting some sort of, again, like the emergency funds or the IRF funds that will be directed to green investments would be necessary, but I think with a backstop by the ECB. There are other proposals out there where the ECB might make a per capita distribution of funding for every country, and that will kind of provide sort of the net contribution of financial resources to a nation to then spend more flexibly and freely. So I think that these, Elena can say what is the appetite for these kinds of challenge, but it seems that this is the key, to have a net spender and for the Euro area as a whole.
Thanks. And I will indeed turn to Elena and try to discuss a bit the political feasibility of some of what we've been discussing, because there is obviously limits which are put in by the fact that the EU and especially the Council is a body that tries to operate by consensus, especially on these matters. And so I would like to briefly go back to Recovery Fund instrument and in what way it could provide a sort of blueprint for what a fiscal union could look like in the future. As you and our audience probably know, many have called for the replication of these instruments in France and in Italy. Even ECB Chief Christine Lagarde has spoken of a possible Eurozone budget to be used in future crises. But Commission officials so far have stayed rather clear of making this a possibility, rather preferring to say, as Elena mentioned just earlier, this is an experiment and we'll see what we can do with it if it works and once it works. I would like to ask, however, to Elena if she can give us some clarity on what, according to her, are the success markers of such an experiment that would give us the condition for a new form of fiscal buffer for the EU.
Oh, thanks a lot. This debate is very, very interesting and very useful. And I would love to be able to express myself in a free-thinking manner, let's say, but it's not my role, unfortunately. What I want to say by this is that lots of things you are throwing into the debate are, I would say, well known and well analyzed and well considered and so on and so forth by all my colleagues that work on fiscal policy. Now, our challenge in the European Commission is also to come up with something that is going to have some chances to get through, because we have done many things. I could list the number of proposals that we have put forward that have gone nowhere, and that doesn't really help. And that's the difficulty, as you also said, that there are different views. But at the same time, I mean, the views that countries are putting forward are not something that comes from a genetic or historical or archaeological reason. It is something that it is built up by the political choices in those countries. So the position that Germany takes is the result of the German politics and what the German elections and the German debate is putting forward. So we really need to compose with all that. And this is now changing very rapidly in the European context, and not always for the good, I would say, in terms of being able to, to build a position that goes into a direction of maybe being more ambitious. But let's see. So our task, I think, in terms of European Commission is to come up with, after all these consultations, with something that we assess with having some chances to be implemented. And that's why I think if we are successful with the instruments that we have put in place for the crisis, in particular SURE and RRF, we increase the chances of being able to come forward with something a little bit more ambitious. And when I say successful, I think it is basically that it has played a role in helping the countries to converge, because for once these instruments are fitting the countries in a differentiated manner. So those that have less fiscal space get more than those that have more fiscal space. That's the first time in such a scale. Second, that it is EU borrowing. First time we do that. It is not EU budget, because as you said, Pavlina, budget is very small. It's EU borrowing. It's kind of the first time we have been allowed to do that. So we have to show that it is successful, which seems to be the case. With the experience with SURE is a sort of top up. So it's a top up of existing national systems, because it is an area where EU cannot for the moment go into designing the unemployment systems of the countries, but topping up. And in fact, I think countries have learned also that topping up certain systems provides better results than other systems. So that will provide also incentives, seems to me, to countries change their schemes. And with the RRF, I think that what the degree of success is that indeed these reforms, the combination of reforms and investment, is going to increase the capacity of the economies to be resilient to growth and to address also the inequalities that have been increasing during the crisis. And the capacity of the countries to actually implement that and use that money, because that's another matter. It's not just having the money available, but for the countries being able to use it in the way it is planned to be. So I think that for me is the sign, and with that we can have a chance to say, look, this works, and this is something that complements very well the fiscal policy at the country level. Then another thing that I think it's very difficult, I don't really see exactly where we can go in the medium term, is, as I said, the combination of spending and taxing, because taxing is a very fundamental democratic right. But after all, what you can do with fiscal policy is the result of the political choice in a given context about how much taxing you want to have or you are ready to accept. And we don't have that at the EU level. So that's something that we need to integrate. And just a last comment that was triggered by the remarks from Vivian, that having a democratic dialogue is something, but having the decision-making process that goes with that is something else, because you can have a very interesting dialogue, but if you don't have a decision-making, so who takes the political decisions, who takes the policy decision about the different measures, etc. So that's still something else. So I don't think we are yet at that point, but just to point that out. Thank you.
Thanks for responding also to the other points. I'd like maybe to put this question to everyone who's willing to answer, maybe starting with Sandrine, which is the last time around when the EU was in a crisis and there was a proposition to have some common solutions, some common debt, there was a lot of talk about moral hazard and the risk that if we are to become a permanent net transfer union, then some countries may be incentivized to run permanently high levels of debt, excessive debt, given that eventually they will be bailed out by the rest of the EU. Perhaps this ties in also to what, not in the spirit, but it is tied to what Pavlina was saying about having the net fallback option in the Eurozone. So what could be the solution to this moral hazard, either in political terms or in policy terms? And I'd open that question to whoever wants to start first.
Pavlina, do you want to start first? Because I'm not a Eurozone expert. The only thing that I would say is that, and I agree this is where the complexity lies, right? Is how do we actually ensure that we do transition at this time rather than enable countries to just run huge amounts of debt, and also to make countries feel, or member states, that we will enable them to do whatever they please without actually thinking through the consequences of what that means. In my case, very much on the natural boundaries and on the way in which we truly try to protect people's lives and livelihoods. And finding that balance is extremely difficult. And I'm not a Eurozone or a fiscal policy expert. So I don't know if Pavlina or Vivian have real solutions to this, but I do see that this is the tension. I mean, you have very clearly unpacked what the key tension is. And how do we ensure that we bring all member states on this very important journey, which is to have direct stimulus plans and private and public finance that is profitable, that enables win-win opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, promote material circularity and regenerative agriculture, restore nature, support jobs and livelihoods, at a time when we know that people are also coming out of an economic downturn post-COVID.
I think
Pavlina was having a sound alarm.
I think it stopped. Yes, I'm okay now. Thanks. I think that's the role of Europe, to set the guidelines for the specific mission-driven investments, right? That there will be some goalposts in terms of mission reductions, unemployment reduction, poverty reduction. And I think that's where we can do a lot to move forward with some sort of social policy integration, not just macroeconomic integration, but also social policy integration. You know, I mentioned how we have become accustomed to elevated levels of unemployment, and the Commission has thought about this. And we do have some policies in place on the books that can help, like the youth guarantee. Now, what if that was a mission, provided a mission that countries should proceed to provide employment options in green jobs, green investments, locally, domestically, to address environmental concerns and tackle both unemployment and climate issues at once. And there, you know, I know the Commission provides a little bit of funding and it's a top up, but perhaps they might be some thinking about, you know, making it even more feasible and possible, because I don't think the take up has been significant on the youth guarantee from individual nation states, but that is a framework for thinking and moving forward. I think that the issue of moral hazard is now an issue of overspending on perhaps wasteful kind of, you know, in wasteful directions. And so these clear parameters of what we consider to be public purpose in Europe, I think would be a useful way to move forward. How to address what are known as public health deserts in Europe, right? Provide quality care within reasonable distance to communities. How about addressing, you know, any food desert shortages? I think in Europe that might be less of a concern than in the United States, but there are communities that, you know, don't have access to quality food. And Europe is a wealthy region that is wasting resources right now because we have had a lost decade, and we are at the risk of losing another if we go back and focus on just fiscal discipline without guidelines. So I think that, yeah, we can spend money better. Like we know this. We did a little calculation with some colleagues in France. You know, there are lots of subsidies that are given to private actors for job creation, but the net job impact is small. And if you calculate those exact same subsidies, if they were provided directly for public service green employment, then you have a far greater net job impact and environmental impact. So I think that there is a way of doing things better and relaxing the fiscal space without giving a free license to spend on whatever.
Paula, can I just jump on this point? Because I think we often forget to talk about the perversities in the market, and we always talk about new capital or new public spending. And actually, there is so much that can be done if we optimize the spending that already is happening. And I so agree with Pavlina. I mean, in so many ways, those that are obvious are fossil fuel subsidies and agriculture subsidies. But even as Pavlina has brought forward within our social markets and the way in which we look at labor, all of these shifts, if we could properly identify them all together and demonstrate this to member states, I think would already be a huge, huge way forward.
So if I could just jump in here and pick up on a number of these really important points that were made. And just in terms of moral hazard, the last time, it was about worries that people would assume that they could overspend whichever way they wanted to spend and no one would stop them. Obviously, I don't think any country, any fiscal authorities believe that now. They know that the ESM is there and that if they have to go to the ESM, in their minds are always Greece or Portugal. Very harsh conditionality. No one's going to want that. So I think much more important than this sort of general question about moral hazard is what Sandrine has pointed out, is how do you ensure the proper kind of investment for, and Sandrine, you're absolutely right to say, sustainable growth. It is not about growth for any reason, but sustainable growth that means to make the planet survive, to make people's lives better, to address questions of inequality and all the rest. And for that, one does need to invest in, as I mentioned earlier, in education, in training, also to provide unemployment funds and all the rest. And I do take Elena's point that the problem is, of course, that you have to get political agreement on all of this. So how do you do that? And it seems to me that decentralizing, democratizing the process can help in many ways. At the national level, as Pavlina mentioned, with all these various kinds of deserts, if you decentralize the process, i.e. if the European semester becomes one where it's not just national capitals deciding, oh, we'll invest in this or that, and oh, it just happens to already to be in our budget, and therefore they'll do the green that they've already decided. I should add, though, that if they do the green that they've already decided, and they get the money from the EU in that way, there's more money available for them to invest in other necessary areas. So it's not all lost. It creates space for investing in education, training, etc., poverty alleviation, but one has to make sure that that happens. So how do you do that? Obviously, one way is the Commission is there to oversee the process, and I think that's tremendously important, and to make recommendations on how that should happen. But on top of that, then it's national capitals that generally suggest what they want to do. If one could ensure that the national capitals would then have to go to the regions, the cities, also rural areas, to ask people, so how do we invest in the future? That might make a difference. And here I'm thinking, actually, there's an historical example in France with Le Plan. This was de Gaulle's idea of going back to the regions and activating the force vive to think about how do you move forward. And the plan was actually a success, mainly because of the way in which it activated people to think about how to invest in the future. And I think that's the way to do it, to really engage civil society, to engage not only national parliaments, but local level governments as well. And I think, and that's why I said, but that's at sort of the national level, but at the EU level as well. And Elena is right to say democratic dialogue is great, but what about the political, who takes the policy decisions? I mean, in some ways, this is really about talking about the direction. It may even be talking about what level of inflation do we need, or how do we do sustainable growth? But then the ECB is already independent. Nonetheless, what it means is it can take as legitimation a new discussion about the need to invest in green bonds or to deal with issues of inequality. The other issue would be, as Sandrine said, rethinking our economic philosophy, really. And how do you do that? I think only in a sort of grand dialogue of this kind. And then maybe the political decisions will follow, maybe not, but we've got to hope. I mean, politicians are responsive to their national publics, and perhaps this is about getting, all EU member states and their national publics together to think about how we move forward. We've seen in the past the sort of the whole race toward austerity started in as a result of the kinds of responses that you got and the negative politicization, if you will, with the Eurozone crisis. It seems to me that we had a kind of positive politicization with COVID-19 in terms of stepping up. And here I think we have to do a lot to thank the Commission for coming up with really brave new ideas, innovative ideas that were taken up. I mean, it was extraordinary. And I think it tells us something about how the Commission has thought very long and hard about the problems with the Eurozone response, especially in the early years, and has done its best to come up with new ideas. It can only suggest incremental changes and increasing sort of flexibility in the rules during the Eurozone crisis. But once COVID hit, it also came up with new ideas. So I'll stop there.
If I may, on that point, just a second, I think that indeed the whole point is about to have a system in its complexity that provides the right incentives, both to those that decide on where to put the capital, be public or private, and for those that decide on the priorities, let's say. And I think that the idea of the fiscal rules, just to go back to that, is if we believe, as we do, that there is a need to provide some guidance for the national fiscal policies, okay, we need to think about that aspect. But this is one element, because then we have all the rest you have been raising here about other instruments, other forms of financing that are there or can be created. And that has to be complementary. And on what we have tried now during these crisis times with the RRF, for instance, or with the InvestEU, is to design that instrument, not just to say, here is that amount of money, but to say, okay, to use that funding, there are a number of policy priorities that are defined by the legislator, by the policy decision that designs the instrument. And ex ante that you have to do as much of green, you have to do as much of digital, and a number of other things. So that's the ex ante. And then member states go with that, talk at home. And there is true that the EU level did not intervene as much as maybe Vivian would like to see. But you can see differences across countries in the way these programs have been generated. Some much more with an open debate, some more the national government has decided on the priorities. So there are lots of things to learn there on how these programs have been designed. But first, there is the policy guidance ex ante, which is decided by the center, okay, by the EU. The Commission proposes, and then the Council and the Parliament adopt the regulation. The same applies to InvestEU, where we are still in the making, but the regulation is there. If you go through, the policy priorities are absolutely designed. So it's not that this money can finance whatever. There is the social window, the research and investment window, the SMEs, and the green. And that's precisely, you want to guide the public guarantees that you will put there, and you want to guide the private capital that will go together with the public money. So I think it's important in terms of providing the right incentive. So that's the way I look at it. Let's try to define the new economic governance in a way that provides the right incentives. And another element that it is going to be different, but we still need to think about that, is this European semester is going to change, that's for sure. And the experience of the RRF is going to be very telling, because the RRF is much more intrusive. much more intrusive, because member states agree and the council takes a decision on the programs, and there are a number of milestones, targets that countries need to do, and then when it's done, they can get the financing. So it's not the same type of policy recommendations that we had with the semester. So, okay, now that's part of the reform of the economic governance as well.
A big part, I would say, a big change to put the money and tie it to the structural reforms. Thank you so much, everyone. I think to allow sufficient time for some Q&A, I will turn now to the results of our second poll. So the question was whether our audience is confident that a result of the review of the economic governance of the EU will happen before 2022, the end of next year. And no is the majority answer with 72%, to which I could just maybe fire a last question to Elena saying, is there a backup plan? If there is no consensus reached by next year, what is the backup plan for the Commission?
Can you just repeat again the question, because I didn't hear you very well?
Yeah, I was just letting you all know that our audience is rather not very confident that there will be a consensus on the new fiscal rules and in the economic governance review of the EU by next year, as wished by President von der Leyen. So my question then is there a backup plan if there is no consensus next year?
Well, good question. There will have to be a back plan, but we will not think about it ex ante.
Elena, do we hear you?
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, so no, I think that if everything goes wrong, we always have a back plan, but that's not the way we approach it, because we really want to well, first of all, consensus, yes, but not everything needs to be agreed by consensus in that area. So we have to see how the discussion evolves. But I think it is very important, as I said, the experience, the way we present it, the way we build this process of consultation that helps in building consensus, and that we avoid positions being taken too early in the process to say this no, or this we cannot envisage. So we want to conduct that in a way that we manage to build some common ground, let's say, even if then in the fine print there will be different views, but that we don't start by the, let's say, well-known position. So we really want to not to put this debate in the context of the well-known frugal countries and the well-known peaks and the well-known this and that. This is not going to help. So we really need to find a new ground and a new political approach to that based on the positive experiences. And I think we have now some recent positive experiences that we have to build upon.
Thanks a lot for that. Going as far as you can in answering our questions. I'd like to now open a bit to the audience, and we have one question. I think the first could be perhaps for Sandrine, the one who brought us a bit to think about beyond GDP, considering this timely confidence conference, and says, ecological economist Kate Raworth has commented that given the severe ecological crisis we are facing as a result of our economic activity, economists should adopt a growth agnostic stance, developing policies that are not dependent on future economic growth. What sorts of measure would the panelists recommend in order to reduce growth dependency in the economy while also supporting vital social needs, including reducing poverty and inequality? Would anybody like to answer that?
Well, I can start with the fact that actually there already are 5 well-being economies, and Kate Raworth has now adopted her donut in a variety of different cities. And so this is real, because there are several other questions that have come in. What does it mean to look at beyond GDP? Well, it means that you bundle actually social, environmental, and economic indicators, but that your premise is not that growth at all costs is what is actually going to make people happy or truly live within a well-being economy. So you're shifting your premise to very much value-based types of indicators. And the question there is, how do you assess these new indicators? And what we need to do in that case, Paula, is to think through, and sorry, I've got water just coming down. It's raining all of a sudden like crazy here. Apologies, I don't know if you can hear me. I can barely hear myself. But one is we have to redefine prosperity, and we need to, within our economic structures and finance, put a value on what it actually means to be prosperous, because we know that growth has not necessarily made us more prosperous. So what are these new indicators in that perspective? One is having access to social services, ensuring that actually people have access to education. So this is one way that you start to reevaluate what it means to have a prosperous economy. We also have to redefine natural resource use, and we need to very much place a value on what our natural resources are. So costing externalities, ensuring that we're not enabling polluting services or products and instead enabling non-polluting services and products. So this is part of how you start to evaluate what those important indicators are. And clearly at the end of it, we will need to have the right metrics. And this comes back to the rulemaking that Pavlina brought up, and I think Vivian brought up as well. We have to shift the rules based on this new value-based economic and financial system that we're putting in place. And my last point would be, for me, and if you even look at ESG decision-making now in funds, which by the way are very superficial in comparison to what we're talking about in terms of key fiscal shifts, what has happened during COVID is that we've seen a tripling of investment in environment, social, and governance funds because they have been de-risked. They've been de-risked because actually they're truly looking at the entire value chain and ensuring where are the key failures within that value chain. This demonstrates to us that actually this is a possible way of moving forward that will enable us to be more resilient as we create those very strong investment opportunities. So I think this is a positive win-win. It's not just a negative, because we often talk about the negatives of transforming. I actually think there is a very positive resilience case to future shocks and stresses coming from climate change, coming from biodiversity loss, and coming from the social tipping points that we will see if we don't deal with these shocks.
Thanks for that. I'd like to maybe put the second question by Colleen Schneider to Pavlina, since it addresses some of what she's talked to us about. Growing out of debt versus austerity to balance budgets is a problematic framing, because it assumes that growth is good in and of itself and debt is bad in and of itself. What would a fiscal framework look like that is grounded in well-being, equity, and sustainability, rather than growth versus debt logic? So rather than thinking of the rules, which Pavlina said we could do away with these numbers, and Vivian came to this point as well, what should the goal be for fiscal policy? If you were to really summarize it in the fewest words you can, in a tweet.
Okay, there's some very basic fundamentals for what fiscal policy should do. And fiscal policy is there to provide macroeconomic support when the private sector retreats or when we experience severe crisis. That's the very first thing that it must do. And to do it, it needs flexible finance. The second thing that it needs to do is tackle very concrete public service objectives that private sector does not have the incentive to tackle. Things that don't have an obvious social commercial return, but have obviously important necessary social returns: public health, unemployment, inequality, and the whole environmental concerns. The third thing that it should do is patient investment, right? To undertake enormous investments that the private sector cannot undertake on short order, or it requires time, or again, the right incentives. But I think that there are a couple of things we need to think about in terms of what the fiscal policy framework in Europe is. The first one, it has not delivered growth. I think we want to be clear about that. We have had a lost decade. The Eurozone has existed for 20 plus years, and we have had a lost decade at the risk of losing another. It had not delivered stability. And whether the stability is I would say the instability is somewhat endogenous, but even if you take the view that these are external shocks like finance and environmental, like pandemics, we are not able to deal with them unless we break the rules and we come up with new tools that are now readily available. So we should totally not ignore them and embrace them. The next thing that I think it's important to notice is that we have not suffered from overspending. I don't think that's been the issue, right? The decades of austerity have left us, our public services weaker, the kind of things we consider to be essential for normal well-being civilized life. So we have not overspent. The growth in debts and deficit has been either collapse in incomes and tax revenue or responding to emergencies. And so looking forward, I think we have to just recognize that these are unavoidable expenses. They are part of what we will be facing. They will be floods, they will be mudslides, unfortunately, they will be climate-related issues that we will have to reckon with, and governments, whatever rules we impose on them, they will be breached because governments will just have to respond. And if they have to mediate between two competing goals, like some sort of arbitrary debt to GDP ratio or tackling the public health concerns, environmental concerns, they may choose wrong, right? They may choose to balance budgets and then sacrifice well-being and responding to these crises. So I think that this would be the starting point for me as we think about fiscal policy and all of the things that Sandrine mentioned. We have a holistic systems thinking about how to move forward to create a well-being. The only other thing I would like to add is that we do have resources, we do have technology. Now we have financial tools that are available in Europe, but we don't really have time. We don't really have time, and I don't think that we can structure the right commercial return to get the private sector to, mobilize finance. The public sector has to do it. Private finance will naturally follow because of the de-risking, because of the net injection that the governments can make, the net positive contribution to the investment environment and incomes and growth. And then, private investment will, of course, follow, and some sort of partnership will be necessary to tackle the big, big questions.
I'll take perhaps one last question, and I'll put that to Vivian. This question deals more with the economic sentiment and the narrative that we have around economic governance in the EU. Odysseus Konstantinakos, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, asks, I'm wondering to what extent the fundamental economic assumption of the so-called Washington-Berlin consensus, and I think he is mixing the IMF standard prescriptions with what came out of the European Eurogroup during the global financial crisis, to what extent these prescriptions have changed because of the COVID-19 crisis or because there was a policy learning process within the European institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the economic assumptions, the narratives have changed, both because of thinking in the Commission over the long term through the Eurozone crisis, seeing what wouldn't work and trying to get changes, and incremental ones worked. And it wasn't until COVID until you had these new ideas. That's one thing. But also, I think everyone, other than certain frugal four countries, frugal 4+ countries, recognize that this kind of obsession with debt got us nowhere. Pavlina and Sandrine both point to this, but that kind of obsession with debt has been highly problematic. Debt has not been the problem in the Eurozone, and the debt came about not because of overspending, other than the case of Greece, which unfortunately is what started the crisis. So the narrative was used, essentially focused on Greece. But in fact, most countries, we can talk about Spain, Ireland, those in trouble, did not have too much debt. They got the debt because they bailed out the private sector. And so what happened was this shift in narrative very quickly in 2010. 2008 to 2010 had been a narrative of the problem is private debt. We have to do something about the banks. Then the Eurozone crisis hits. Member states bail out their banks, get higher debt, and all of a sudden the narrative shifts to it's a problem with public debt, not private. And then they say that it's actually bad behavior. So, misdiagnosis of the crisis as public debt rather than private. And then misframing or sort of misdiagnosis again in terms of saying that it was a behavioral problem rather than the structure of the euro. And as a result, you got no real solutions, and you got responses that basically told everyone to engage in austerity. So even those countries with surpluses didn't spend, didn't invest in digital, in green, or whatever, at best in minor ways. And those countries that were in trouble essentially didn't invest in the way they needed in education, in training, in poverty reduction. And this is something that you saw a major shift with the Juncker Commission from 2015 on, sort of a recognition that we now need to focus on the social. But still, the obsession with debt and with maintaining these rules, governing by rules and ruling by numbers in the minds of most of the member states, meant that you didn't get the kind of investment you need. Once COVID-19 hit, what was quite extraordinary is all member states went ahead on their own without informing the Commission that basically went ahead and threw all the money that was necessary to fight the crisis, to support jobs, to do what they needed to do. And the Commission then followed by suspending the rules. All of that is tremendously important. And I think there's now a much better recognition, general recognition of the problems. But it's not, we're not there yet, not necessarily, as Elena reminded us. There are in the EU serious problems in terms of the politics with with some people continuing to be obsessed with debt. And without recognizing that unless we address these major problems, we're in deep trouble. And these problems are not only with climate, with poverty, and all of that. It's also with the rise of populism. It's anti-system challenger parties that are going to blow everything up if one doesn't address these serious issues. People vote for populist parties for a range of reasons, socioeconomic, sociocultural, but also political. The take back control is a very serious problem, in particular where populist parties want to go back to the national level. I think the only answer is therefore, and that's why I've been talking about decentralizing and democratizing the governance processes, is bring those decisions back to the people in ways, or at least the debates, in ways that they feel that they can make a difference, and also that their lives are better. And this is about cleaning up the environment. And as Pavlina said, also dealing with the deserts, in particular these peri-urban and rural areas where people are angry, and for good reason. We need to bring back public services. We need the state, actually, national and EU level, needs to engage in much greater, better industrial strategy. You need a smart state. We need state industrial strategy to engender the necessary changes, not substituting for markets, but encouraging markets to go in the right direction. But of course, this can only work really by democratizing economic policy. And this doesn't mean just saying that the people should talk, but rather having more deliberation among experts and politicians with all the people in order to try to, work from the bottom up at the national, in sort of local, regional, national level, but also at the top, at the EU level, because I see no other way out of this problem. Yeah.
Paula, can I just I know you wanted to say something, so maybe I won't jump in, but I love the way Vivian has just gone forward.
Perhaps we'll try to wrap it up unless there is any very short final comments, round of comments from Sandrine or Elena.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly indicate that Vivian is spot on, and we need to hit people where they are. I mean, if you get into the granularities of fiscal policy, they won't know what the heck you're talking about. And the problem is the backlash is that not only will we also annoy at the nation states or the member states if we look at populism, which will continue to grow, and certain member states may decide to exit the EU once again, and we get back into the kind of tensions that we saw around the austerity discussions. And that's why I think the Commission needs to get better at explaining why this is important at a variety of different levels, from social, environmental, talking to rural communities as well as urban communities, because this is where we're really seeing the disenfranchisement with regard to populism. And Vivian is absolutely correct in saying we now have seen a series of decentralized approaches that work, whether they be citizen assemblies, whether they be encouraging broader dialogue, which enables this to happen. So let's make sure as we straddle this shift, and I would say the shift has to be much bigger than we're talking about right now, we have to make sure that we properly create the communication plans and the outreach plans to enable people to get on the journey. And that's fundamental across the board.
If I may on that, I think that it is very important to put in place such discussions and all that. And making sure that this is done in a way that makes sense, because sometimes the EU level has undertaken some of these things with a completely bad result, in the sense that it was perceived like something from the wanting to be imposed from the top. So I think it is really a partnership between the different levels of political power to conduct this necessary discussion to identify the change and to make everybody part of it. And I think this is really a big challenge, but I can only share what you say. But again, I mean, I think it's something we cannot get it wrong. It cannot be attributed to the EU level or to the national level or to any level. I think it has to be a joint operation. And I think that all these very bold and ambitious proposals require a lot of explanation and a lot of caring about the transition, because the transition will be costly for some people, regions, sectors, etc., etc. We all know that the analyses are there, etc. But it's more about how do we manage that transition in order to make sure that we get where we want to go. And I think that it is very easy and risky to also come with statements that can be perceived, at least for some, like populist, like we don't care about that doesn't matter, we don't care about a GDP, or I see what you say, but I mean, I think the situation today is much more complex than this. So those that are in this business, including me, we need to think about how to explain these things, because if we go out with this sort of statements, for me, it is very dangerous. So I don't have the recipe, but I just wanted to share that reflection, that going out with these things, it's very easy to convince people and everybody will be very sympathetic to us, but I'm not sure that this is exactly very helpful. What I also think is that it is clear that we need a partnership between public and private, and that's also something quite difficult sometimes to design, but for sure we need to have the public sector can have the resources, and they can be money, but they can also be the legislative, the framework to put things in place that are going to mobilize also the rest of the available resources in the society to reach these transition objectives and so on that we are discussing. Thanks.
Thanks all so much for your very interesting contribution on the ground policy and from an outside perspective. I'd like to try and wrap up these 2 hours of discussion almost. Hopefully my connection will carry me through. But I think that the words which stuck with me most were ambitious, meaning that any reform of the European economic governance needs to ask the question of what are we trying to achieve, and that perhaps the rules should be geared toward the goal rather than incrementally changing the rules as we have them today. So having very well in mind how to tackle the crisis of the present and of the future, and working backward from there, giving incentives. So part of the way to overcome political backlash or political resistance to more fiscal space and to pooling more resources is to ensure that everybody sees the benefit in this. So to give the incentives and also to ensure that this is a guided process in some way. And we have an example in the RRF of how that could be done in terms of interaction and co-ownership of resources between member states and the Commission, so that it's not, Washington Berlin consensus from above, but it's something that member states feel very much attached to and empowered to. And then investment, I think, was the huge one mentioned by all of you. There is investment gaps in pretty much every field that we look at, when we look at climate, when we look at health, when we look at education and research and development and so on. Of course, the public purse cannot at EU or national level cover all of that, but it needs to be able to at least provide an incentive also for the private investment to step in. And so how to recreate that fiscal space, that room for investments at national, but also at EU level, that's a question for the Commission and for member states as they prepare to discuss fiscal rules and also process, because everything which will be done will need to be explained to citizens. If, as at the end of the discussion, we started debating about populism, which was in part arguably a result of the response to the global financial crisis. So how to avoid that this time? Perhaps opening up this debate at the broadest level possible, as Vivian put it, could be one of the solutions. I haven't summarized everything. This is what I am taking home from this discussion. But I would like to thank once again the organizer for giving us the chance to debate this very important topic this afternoon, and all of you. So Vivian, Pavlina, Elena, and Sandrine, thank you so much. It was a pleasure discussing for you, and thank you very much for me.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Paula. Thanks to everyone. It's great.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of the week from the organizers. Just a reminder, it's a week-long event, and you can find all of the follow-up events at fiscalmatters.eu. Thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Fantastic. Take care. Stay safe.